first night on patrol with my training coach turned into a long one. Instead of getting off at 11:45, we didn't return to the precinct until 4 a.m. A drunk driver had sailed off the road and into a slough, and we had to wait for a tow truck to extract it so we could get a body count. My second night on the job, I stepped on an aorta, which 30 minutes earlier had been inside of a drunken stepfather's chest, but his 16-year-old stepson, angry from watching the man once again beat his mother with a glass ashtray, had retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs and fired one into this man's heart, blowing the aorta 10 feet down a hallway. I was assigned the most active district in the city right out of the academy. As a recently returned Vietnam veteran, violence in court didn't bother me much, but I was forced to learn the ways of a street cop at an accelerated rate. Within a few months, prowler calls, burglaries, drunk drivers, family fights, and bar brawls became routine, occasionally punctuated with a felony car stop, at gunpoint, a man with a knife call, a terrible traffic accident, and a child abduction. My experiences were probably no different than most cops that work in the city. Some would agree with me that although police calls involve different participants at different locations and under different circumstances, there is still a sameness to them. The complainants are basically similar. The suspects are the usual bottom feeders, and the paperwork is always the same. In time, street patrol becomes a monotonous routine. So how can a bar fight or a drunken car crash be mundane? When the officer has seen it all before 100, maybe hundreds of times. Then on one occasion, the officer sees something, hears something, or feels something, and it doesn't compute. It doesn't fit the norm of the police job, and the police norm is crazy to begin with. In fact, it doesn't fit anything outside of it either. It isn't logical, it isn't normal, it doesn't fit the officer's self-prescribed rules, tactics, or worldview of how things are supposed to work. The something I'm referring to is what this book is about. Ghosts, spirits, UFOs, demons, sinister sounds, uncommon feelings, strange touches, sudden and profound depression, people vanishing in clear view in haunted places. In an article in the Scientific American, Ghost Stories Visits from the Deceased, December 2nd, 2008, the University of Göteborg found that over 80% of elderly people experienced hallucinations of their partner within a month after their passing. Almost one-third of the 80% reported that they spoke to the partner. On a personal note, a week or so after my mother died, I was in my office working. As clear as a rung bell, I heard "Lauren" whispered in her voice from behind me. I startled and turned around to find only an empty room. It was at once unnerving and sort of comforting. Someone say she was saying goodbye. The Scientific American, being scientific and all, call these sightings hallucinations, but they admit their knowledge ends there. They say, despite the fact that hallucinations are one of the most common reactions to loss, they have barely been investigated and we know little more about them. They then went on to say that the majority of people reading the article will re-experience the dead. There are many, many stories in books, magazines, YouTube, and in blogs about the recently deceased being seen again by loved ones. There are also stories of people minutes away from death seeing loved ones that have already died waiting for them on the other side. Cops respond to death scenes all the time. I worked in an area for a while where I was getting at least one dead body call a week. So many that other officers were calling me the death car. I didn't experience anything out of the ordinary at these, but other cops have. Unlike those in the Scientific American study, they didn't know the recently deceased. Still, they experienced something. Roanoke's busy city center is abundant with striking historic buildings, fine dining, and a variety of small shops and large department stores where one can while away a fun-filled day. It's a medium-sized town with crime problems, typical of other like-sized cities across the country. I served on the Roanoke Police Police Department for 27 years, retiring in 2002. As a detective sergeant in the mid-1980s, my partner, David Ragland, and I were working a burglary detail patrolling in uniform in an unmarked van. It was just before twilight when we spotted a suspicious-looking vehicle moving slowly through a neighborhood. We began to tail him, thinking he was possibly casing houses, but he quickly made us and took off at a high rate of speed. We called for a uniform car to stop him, and though he was doing 70 miles per hour, we did our best to keep him in our sights as we followed an hour unmarked. It eventually became apparent that he was heading toward Schaefer's Crossing, a 100-foot-long concrete railroad tunnel. Pursuits are always risky, and never more so than when a desperate man is pushing his vehicle close to 75 miles per hour. Then, as quickly as it begun, the pursuit came to an abrupt, explosive stop. We'll never know if the driver overcompensated his steering or lost control in a moment of panic, exhilaration, or any number of other causes. But for whatever reason, he navigated his two sons of steel, chrome, and rubber straight into the concrete archway. Dave Ragland and I were about 200 feet behind the speeding car when it crashed, and we both watched in shock as the destroyed vehicle lifted about 2 feet into the air. We remained in control of our van and ourselves and stopped a ways behind the crash. Just as shocking was when the suspect driver, a white male, 5 feet 10 inches, and husky at about 180 pounds, squeezed out of the small driver's window seemingly unscathed and dashed off into the tunnel. As longtime partners are disposed to do, we didn't waste a second talking about it, but instead took off at a dead run after the man. He was running hard, but so were we, and we never lost sight of him. We managed to close the distance and got close enough to see him clearly, that is, until he vanished. We stopped. What the? There were no exits in the tunnel, period. We looked all around, examined every inch of the passageway, but there was simply no trace of him. None. We were disconcerted, confused, and feeling every other kind of emotion as we reluctantly headed back to the tunnel's entrance. As we neared the crash site, we could see our van, the totaled suspect car, and the driver, the suspect. It was the same man. Clothes, height, and weight we had just been chasing, but he was sitting in the car, in the driver's seat. The steering wheel and the dashboard had crushed his chest, killing him. Shocked, we managed to call for a supervisor and a traffic unit to come to the scene. We told the supervisor what had occurred, how we had spotted the suspicious vehicle, pursued it, witnessed the crash, ran up to the driver, but lost him when he simply vanished right in front of us, only to find him a few minutes later behind the wheel of his car, his life crushed out. The supervisor was an older and wiser man, especially wise in the ways of the department and how other cops think. He told us to write our reports, but leave out all references to us pursuing the dead man on foot. In short, don't say anything about chasing the spirit or whatever it was. Dave Ragland and I are both retired now and still friends. He's very religious and church-going man, and while I've occasionally talked about that evening, he still has no opinion on what we saw, nor do I. Both of us have discussed it with this minister, but no explanation has come forth from him either. That is, no explanation other than we saw and chased the actual spirit of the deceased driver still fleeing from the police. Next story. Dispatch said, "You got one not seen for several days, and the complaint is this: there's a foul odor coming from his apartment. One not seen is never a good call, especially on a steamy 95-degree July day with the humidity dense enough to support aquatic life. Whenever I had one of these, it was always such a pleasure to step outside afterward and take a deep breath, not only to cleanse my lungs, but also to exhale the image of death from my head before going on to the next call. But this time it was different. This time something left with me. The awful stench was apparent from the parking lot, though the apartment in question was 303, 3 floors up, and it only got worse as we climbed the stairs. The complainant lived 2 us in front of the apartment, unlocked the door, and quickly left, leaving us to open it, either for legal reasons or because he didn't want to get knocked back by the smell. Smart guy. We opened it a crack and announced ourselves. Richmond Police. Anybody home? Silence. We nudged the door open to a blast of heat and an unbearably thick, gut-wrenching odor. I attempted to step inside, but the stench was so overpowering, I had to back out. My partner gave it a try too, but he didn't make it any farther than I did. A third officer joined us, and he was also forced back out into the hallway. There was no doubt in our minds that Mr. Jones was inside and had been long deceased. The homicide detectives arrived and, apparently accustomed to the odor of death, went in, found Mr. Jones, and quickly determined his death was a natural passing. Later we learned he had died about 2 weeks prior. Although it was impossible to imagine that the smell could get worse, it did when the body retrieval services arrived and began moving the man. He was bloated to double his original size and on the verge of splitting open. For transport, these people do this several times a day in the city and have seen every form of death. But they said they hadn't had a deceased person in such bad condition in years. Although the ravages of 2 weeks and the terrible heat made worse by an oven left on had affected the deceased far worse than others I'd seen, the investigation, body removal, and paperwork were all routine. That is, mostly routine. Something happened to me in the man's apartment, though I didn't realize it until I got home around 2 a.m. I stripped off my fouled uniform and left it at the back door. I quickly showered, all the while amazed at how overwhelmingly fatigued I was. I attributed it to the unusual intensity of the circumstances. Heat, odor, and decay of the body. That was beyond anything I'd experienced. Still, the deep exhaustion surprised me. There was also something else, and it was profoundly disconcerting. I had never felt anything like it before any time in my private life, during or after any other police situation, and never after a dead body call. I could feel the dead man's presence. I almost felt like he was trying to cling on to me. No, it wasn't his odor, and it was intense. I'm talking about his spirit. Yes, his spirit. And I could feel it hovering over me, as if trying to possess me. It was so intense, so tangible, so overwhelming, that I was on the verge of a panic attack. And I never, ever get panic attacks. As I lay in bed, my girlfriend sleeping beside me, I fought the feeling, but it was only getting worse. A sense of being trapped and restrained seemed to be pressing me deeper and deeper into the mattress. It was such an incredibly strange and oppressive energy. I didn't understand what was happening. Why was I feeling this terrible? Then I knew. Just like that, I understood. I never once felt threatened by the presence. I never felt it was going to do me harm. What I was feeling, however, and I was sure of it, was that he was seeking my help. He was trapped, not me. I woke my girlfriend and told her about the call and what I was experiencing. She is a deeply spiritual person, almost medium-like, and she immediately understood what was happening. After asking me a lot of questions about the call, what all I was sensing, and if I would like her to assist, she began to sink into a meditative state of deep concentration to still her mind. She told me she sensed the spirit's energy around me, and she began to put into words things that were unclear to me. As this happened before between us, I trusted her in a realm that was unfamiliar to me, and in so doing, I could feel her calm me. To others, this might seem strange or new age, but I knew what she was doing because I had seen her do it successfully on past occasions. She continually asked if what she was doing resonated with me and if I understood what she was saying. I don't know how much time had passed, but I suddenly knew the spirit was gone. The weight of it had been lifted from me, and I could feel it gone, even before she told me it had been released. Can I explain what I felt, what I knew was happening that night? No. But what I believe is that the dead man's spirit, or whatever it was stuck in the space between his earthly existence and whatever else there is after. I'm convinced he was